So we've talked at length about the fall of Rome and what it would have meant to live through such a brutal and pretty dramatic transition. Today we're going to be looking at how people survived in Western Europe by developing the feudal system. The feudal system was kind of an economic system, sort of, in the sense that it was the way that people got what they needed to survive. They got resources that they needed to survive. It was also a political system because it had a lot to do with power and authority. Um, and eh, so we've talked at some length about what it would have meant to live through the pretty brutal, pretty dramatic transition in Western Europe that was the fall of the Roman Empire and just the conditions that people found in its wake. Today, we're going to look at the system they developed in order to survive those conditions, called the feudal system. The feudal system was some sort of a mix between economics and politics. It's an economic system in the sense that it provided the resources that different people needed in order to survive. It was a political system too, in the sense that it was kind of a formal power structure. If you look at the little social hierarchy pyramid thing in the middle of the slide, you've got a pretty good summary of it. So we're going to be going through that today. And we're going to start, just like last time, with the fall of Rome. This is one of those lessons that if you really think through it, like in its sort of a logical, reasonable sort of way, the feudal system will just make a lot of sense to you and you won't have to do a whole lot of work to remember each little part. If you don't give this your attention, however, it's going to be really hard for you to be able to describe it and explain how it works. But if you put yourself in the shoes of these people that lived through the transition, this is one of the easiest history lessons to learn, I promise. So, the Roman Empire collapses. What does that mean? Well, at its greatest extent, Rome controlled the entire Mediterranean region and most of Europe. And then, as we know, it collapsed due to invasions from kind of waves of Germanic tribes, barbarians as the Romans called them. Now there was no central power to protect people from attack. Long distance trade declined pretty steeply because there was no empire to pay to build or repair roads or provide soldiers to keep them safe. Also, most of the things that Europe used to trade were heavy, like lumber, which are, big tree trunks, which makes them really hard to carry. And without good roads, this becomes nearly impossible. Picture carrying something really heavy through like goopy mud. It doesn't really work. So, Roman cities had been centers of trade. Often this is the case in cities. So without trade, there was no reason to live in cities anymore. And it was pretty unsafe. Have a look at that graph of the population of Rome in the middle of the slide, and you should be able to pick out the moment when the Roman Empire fell and people fled the city of Rome. It's just before the year 500. So there was a need to create a new system to establish order because it would have been chaos. And in this circumstance, what do you think your number one priority would be? You can have a look at the pyramid on the bottom right of the slide to help you think through it. Most people's number one priorities in these circumstances would be survival. Like, I need food, I need water, I need shelter, and I need a place to sleep where I won't get killed. And that's kind of where people stayed for a while. If you're in my class, yesterday, you went through something of a thought experiment to kind of think through how you would survive the fall of Rome. If you missed that class, or if you're not in my class at all, you can pause the slide here and have a look at what the scenario of the fall of Rome might have been like for a commoner, for a noble, and for a former soldier, and think through like row by row. The government has just fallen. Barbarians are pillaging the city. There's no police force. The roads aren't safe. You live in the capital with over 1 million other people. would you survive? What choices would you make? Well, if you're a commoner and you don't own any land, you don't come from a big, powerful family with a network of connections, you have no army training and no weapons, you're probably in some pretty big trouble. Money without the government to assure its value is pretty worthless. So there's that. Would you stay in the capital city of Rome? Probably not. You would probably run away. You can't produce food in a capital city. And once you eat all the rats, there isn't any more. Plus, it's like big time not safe. And being a commoner, you big time don't own weapons and you have no weapons training whatsoever. To get food in the short term, you're probably going to scavenge. You'll eat what you find. But in the long term, you're going to have to farm if you want to eat, but you don't have any land. So you're probably going to have to trade your labor. It's the only thing that you have that's worth anything, your ability to work, for what you need. To assure your safety, you're probably going to have to buddy up with people who have weapons and know how to use them because you do not. And by buddy up, you mean sell your manual labor because, again, that's the only thing of value that you have. Since the possibility of getting an education has vanished, there's absolutely no way for you to improve your society, your standing in society anymore. You will probably die a peasant. Religion becomes your only source of hope for a better life. And at that, you still have to die first and then go to heaven. So, a commoner under these circumstances would probably sell their labor in exchange for a place to eat and some protection. You become a peasant. And you have to farm all of the food for the whole society. If you don't produce enough food, you starve before they do. Here's a good part to mention that a lot of our fairy tales that we know and love come from the Middle Ages, and think about the ones like Hansel and Gretel that involve parents leaving their children in the forest because they don't have enough food for them, presumably to starve to death. Anyway, so commoners out of luck. Let's think about a noble or aristocratic family's situation. If you're an aristocrat or a noble, your wealth comes from owning land, usually in the countryside, and you come from a big important family with lots of connections. And again, your estate in the countryside is huge. So you're not going to stay in the capital city, Rome, either. You're going to go to your fancy country estate. You're probably going to want to build a wall around it, though. And voila, you have castles. To get food, I mean, you're rich, so you don't like working. You have a ton of farmland, but if you can avoid actually doing the actual work, then you're going to. If only there was a supply of people without land who could do all of that hard work for you. To assure your safety, you're definitely going to let some big tough former soldiers live on part of your land in exchange for their protection, because you don't have weapons training either, but you know people who do. Of course, they're going to have to swear an oath to you, and because everybody is super religious, they take their oaths kind of seriously. I mean, they do break them, but it does count for something. If you had been a former soldier in the Roman army, or had been a guard to one of those big fancy aristocratic families during the empire, your story is going to be a little different. You do have a skill that you can kind of trade to get what you need. So you can tell the rich people you'll protect them at their big fancy country estates. And in the short term, you could use your weapons to take food from other people. But in the long term, you'd like to find an arrangement that doesn't require constant confrontation, because that's exhausting even if you do know how to fight. To assure your own safety, I mean, you are your own safety. You really need to worry about food. So a former soldier would probably become a knight. A knight would protect the nobles' families and lands. They'd get to live on some of that land, and in exchange, they would get food that was farmed by all the commoners, like the poor peasant people. These upper classes in the social hierarchy are the only rich people around, and there's no more real specialization anymore, so there's no other classes to threaten that position. In this context, land is everything, because you're not paying anybody money. You're allowing different groups of people to live on different parts of your land. So land is power. You give some to the knights in exchange for their protection, And you let peasants live on tiny little plots and farm food for you. But again, if something happens and there's not enough food, then they go hungry, not you. Cute, huh? So that's how we create the feudal system and the medieval village that you guys have all seen in like a billion movies and TV shows and all that stuff. On this slide, we have a concept map, sort of in bubbles, that kind of takes you through the whole unit and where the feudal system takes European society. As a spoiler, if there's no way to move up in the social hierarchy because there's no money or specialization, people are kind of stuck where they are, which explains why Europe spent a lot of that 1,000-year period of the post-classical period kind of stagnant or in the gutter. So if you like concept maps, this is a good slide to pause on and maybe copy it down in your notes. It will come in handy. It's the entire unit on one slide. And this gets us to our key points. So things that absolutely have to be in your notes. First, I would suggest copying down the little pyramid on the top right of the slide because it shows both the political part of the story, like who has power and why, but also the economic part. How do people get what they need? What are they trading? For our key points, we have covered all of this. The collapse of the Roman Empire left Europe with no central government and no military protection. And now Europe is divided into many separate states ruled by different kings who fought each other from time to time. So Europe still had governments, different governments. It just didn't have one big strong one, and that does actually make a difference. It meant that it was a much less safe place than before. And with no strong central government to keep infrastructure like roads in working conditions, long-distance trade tanked, and cultural diffusion went down the drain with it. Without a strong central government to protect people from raiders, many people fled to the countryside and looked to local nobles who owned land for protection. The population of cities plummeted. This creates the feudal system, in which people traded loyalty and services for land and protection, replacing the money economy of the Roman Empire with a land-based economy. And again, consequences of this. If you don't have coinage, long-distance trade goes down the drain too, and you rely on a ton of peasants farming the lands of the local lord. That giant peasant population is really important to maintain, and later when you learn about the Black Death, you'll see what happens when it starts to get chipped away at. There's very little specialization in this kind of society, except for the knights who have military training, but that's the closest you get. The system provided for people's most basic needs, so people got food and shelter, but it also created a rigid social hierarchy. Elites were able to provide protection for most people, but the system was set up to promote political stability with no social mobility, so no way to move up in class. One thing of note that we're going to talk about next time. Although Western Europe was politically fractured into separate states at this time, European culture as a whole still had one major thing in common, and that was they were deeply Christian, and Christianity at the time in Western Europe was organized by the Catholic Church.